Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session, Ask the Expert on Copyright. I'm the named expert on copyright, Julie Murray. I'm from the Copyright Licensing Agency. Just as a quick intro to my background, I'm not a copyright lawyer. I'm actually an ex-teacher myself, so I worked in education for several years, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to share some information and helpful tips for educators and when they need to think about copyright. And I'm here joined today by two teachers, so if I could pass to Rosie.
Hi, so I'm Rosie. I'm the Teaching and Learning Coordinator at Aldersley Hall School, and I teach English and Maths.
Hello, I'm Alan Williams. I'm a teacher at Altrincham Grammar School for Boys. I teach design and technology and in charge of the publications committee there also.
Super. Well, yeah, thanks both so much for joining us, and thanks so much to Shine for asking me to do this session. So what we've got is a couple of slides that I'll talk you through. And then it's a Q&A, which I'm yeah, there was a wry smile from Alan there, which I know he's got some zingers lined up for me, so we'll see how we go. But yeah, firstly I'll give the background to copyright in case some of you are a bit unfamiliar with it, because in fairness I certainly was when I was teaching. I'd never really thought about copyright or licensing, and then I moved into CLA and I found out all about it. So yeah, just as a quick kind of really generic background, copyright means that when something is created, and in this example we're using a book, it means once it's created, it's automatically protected by copyright. So it doesn't need to be registered. It's not like a patent or perhaps a trademark. Copyright is automatic once an original idea is put down in a physical form. So what that means is that protection is, as an educator, that's quite overwhelming. Every time you want to copy or reuse something else, you would have to seek permission. There are some exceptions to copyright that you might be able to rely on. And the office that would look after those is the Intellectual Property Office, the IPO. And these are really limited scenarios, certain circumstances where you can use material without seeking permission. So for instance, if you're a student writing an essay, you might be able to rely on fair dealing for private research and study. And there are some related to education, so I would encourage you to go to look at them. But in fairness, those exceptions probably aren't going to cover everything you want to do when you think about handing out packs to students and so on and so forth. So you are posed with a bit of a quandary that you might be have to take a lot of time and money to contact publishers, for instance, in the case of books, to ask them if you can copy material from their publications. So what's evolved instead is a system of licensing, and that's where I come in and an organisation like CLA come in. What can happen is that the author or the publisher can opt their material into a blanket license, what's known as a blanket license. And that means an institution can buy that license in order to cover its copying needs. It's a bit like a kind of insurance policy, and it also gives you permissions. We then collect the license fees and also some data about what you're copying. And that then all gets sent back to the royalty payments get sent back to the creators of the original material, the authors and publishers who made the thing that you're copying from. So in a nutshell, that is basically the kind of copyright licensing ecosystem that we work in and that you may have come across, and certainly that you might start thinking about as you work with students on Shine publications. I've mentioned books there, but it's worth bearing in mind that there's a range of different licenses depending on the medium that's covered. So depending on the creation, music, newspaper, film or broadcast, there'll be a different license to cover those things as a teacher and a different organisation to look after them. So CLA look after books and magazines, but another one like ERA looks after broadcasts. You might have heard of PRS, look after music. So depending on the medium, then a different license might be needed, but they all work in really similar ways. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, then the best site to go to is copyrightinschools.org, because that describes the different scenarios you have and what license you might need. In terms of what licenses do you have, in fairness, for a lot of teachers and a lot of UK schools, you'll already have a lot of them because they've been signed off centrally. So certainly in England, the Department for Education has purchased a lot of licenses on behalf of schools, and therefore the school doesn't need to worry about making that purchase and the cover is there already. It's just really important that you know which licenses your school's covered by. In different UK nations, certainly CLA, we've got an agreement with Scotland and Northern Ireland. We're working on one with Wales, but it's worth just talking to either your Department for Education or your local authority to see what licenses you've already got, because it may not be a case that you need to buy them. In the case of independent schools, they are individually purchased, and so maybe talk to your bursar or your finance officer or your librarian. And then I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the CLA license and what it actually lets you do. And just to be clear that licensing covers teachers. Students are a little bit different, and I'm conscious that you might have questions on students, and I'll happily try and answer those if I can. But the license covers teacher copying rather than student copying. So what it lets you do is copy 5% from a publication that your school owns, and you can photocopy it and scan it. And also bear in mind things like typing it up. That's another form of copying. Copying and pasting, if you take something from a website and put it on the internet, that's copying. So our license can kick in to help cover you for that. It gives you peace of mind to know that you're not copying, you're not infringing copyright. Everybody is subject to copyright law in the UK, regardless of age, regardless of your role. Sometimes I've heard the defence, and I probably would have offered it myself, but I'm a teacher, I'm doing it for education. It's still subject to copyright law. So a license does help to give you peace of mind that you're working within the law. And it's also nice to know that you are repaying the creators. So whenever you use our license, whenever you give us a piece of data about what you're copying, it's all feeding into that payment back to the creator who originally made it, the material that you're copying from. You also get a lot of time savings by using our license, because you don't have to spend time and money getting direct permission, as I mentioned. And also, if I could encourage you to visit our site, there's a huge range of some support materials there. So we've got guides about what the license means for you. There's a mini scheme of work that we created to do with students that you can tell them about copyright and kind of start introducing them into that world. We've got video material, we've got competitions. There's a lot on there that we'd be delighted if you have a look at and start to participate and feedback on. So do head to our site and follow us on Twitter. And then also, it's just worth bearing in mind, a little plug for what CLA are doing. There's something called the CLA Education Platform, which is an online platform that helps you make copies digitally, so you don't have to stand at a photocopier and start screaming because it might have run out of toner, which is certainly what I remember doing a lot. But you can make the copy digitally, a couple of clicks, and then share that with your students. So we're trying to make ways to make copyright and copying really transparent, really clear, and really simple and straightforward. So if you head to our site, if you've got any questions about those, then hopefully it's all there for you. And that is the end. I just wanted to point out that if you head to cla.co.uk, there's a whole section dedicated to education and a particular one for schools. And as I say, there's support materials, there's information about the licence, and there's also promotions in terms of competitions and some resources for students. So I will stop sharing my screen, I hope, and get over to the questions. Who'd like to go first?
I'll let Alan go first because the suspense is palpable.
Well, actually, I've got a question raised based on the presentation that you've just given. What would you say are the most common pitfalls that people in a publications committee fall into in terms of the copyright?
That's a great question. I would say the two big things that come up the most are thinking the internet, because it's free to view, is free to use. So that's the phrase we always say, that well, just because it is free to view doesn't mean it's free to use. If you had a book in your hands, you would be a bit more wary about copying a lot from it. But I think there's something about the ease of searching and viewing on the internet and copying and pasting that kind of has muddied the copying waters, as it were, a bit. So we would just say, be cautious when you're using the internet and really check the T's and C's carefully to see that you can copy and reuse material. Because this is where I hear a lot of people say, but it's in the public domain, so isn't that okay? And in copyright terms, public domain means the copyright has expired. So for instance, the works of Dickens, they're now public domain, and Anne Frank's diary, for instance, that recently became public domain a couple of years ago. It doesn't mean that it's in the public domain and free to view equals free to use. So I think that's the one big thing I'd say is caution when you're looking at the internet. And I think particularly with the internet images, because a Google search for images can bring you loads of results, but Google is not a website in itself. It's a search engine bringing through results. So you need to go back to the original website and check that that's letting you use it and you've got permissions to use the image. So I think those are the pitfalls, as you say, that I'd ask people to, I'd encourage people to think about.
I think that ties into one of the questions I've got prepared, actually, which is that the students are only young and cannot really be expected to produce the imagery that they can find elsewhere. By using Google, by using that imagery, what harm are they actually causing?
Well, firstly, Google does have some good tools to help you filter out which images you can use. So if you are on the image search and you look at the tools at the top, just underneath the bar where you key in your search, there is a usage and rights tick box menu. So you can say which ones are free to use. So that can help you in terms of finding ones that are okay. In terms of harm, I think that's a fair question, but I would just say, you know, it's unlikely that somebody's going to go after some kids who have used something in their publication. However, it is about cultivating a habit for life. What if that student goes on to become a photographer or a designer or, you know, creates? If they obviously do that in their employment, they are risking themselves and their company getting kind of a copyright infringement, getting slapped with some kind of takedown order, and it could get quite serious. It could obviously go legal. And also in terms of what they want to create, their work is protected. And so it's just about planting the seeds quite early, I think, if possible, of if you want to use somebody else's stuff, then check that you can. And that's because that person wants to make a living out of it and so on and so forth. I think it's just probably about cultivating a habit there rather than saying maybe do's and don'ts to them, because I appreciate, as you say, some of the students are too young to create their own stuff. But if I can, yeah, just end on that note, that Google's got some helpful tools to help them find images that are free to use.
That's great, thanks. That reminds me of a story, actually, I've read. There was a girl who unfortunately died, and this was in America. And in the school publication, they published her favourite poem, which was also part of the remembrance service for her. But they didn't seek a copyright. They didn't seek permission to print that poem. And the school was actually fined $5,000 as a result of that. And that's something I use often with the students in the publications committee. You know, no matter what the circumstances are or how tragic they may be, we've still got to seek that permission before we use anything that could be under the copyright law.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's a real extreme case. That's rather shocking. And yeah, it is worth noting that American law is different to UK law. It does vary from territory to territory, but I think you've summed it up, Alan. Yeah, it's just whatever the circumstances, you're always best to check.
I've got a question. Have you got any tips for teachers to improve their practice and kind of save time and effort whilst abiding to all the copyright laws?
Yes, that's another great question. I'm thinking back to my own days. I've left the profession about 7 years ago, so I don't know how long I could keep saying I was an ex-teacher. But I think probably what I would encourage people to do, and I'm saying this knowing full well how much pressure, and you know, the pressure on your time, how much, especially of late, the last 2 years has been. But I think that the thing I'd encourage people to do is, if you can, credit sources. So I remember, if I made, I mean, this is probably going to go onto YouTube, but oh well. As I say, I left the profession. But I remember trying to find a starter image. The kids were lining up outside, and I, you know, when you have that last minute kind of, oh, I'm not confident in that starter, I want to change it. So I'd be changing it last minute as the kids were maybe, because I knew that they were wired, or they were, you know, they needed something different. And I'd be going on Google Images and I'd just be pulling stuff through to use in my PowerPoint, say. And then when the kids handed an essay in and it was rinsed from Wikipedia with not even, you know, they'd never said where I was a history teacher. They never said where the sources were from. I was outraged. I was like, why aren't you saying where you're getting your information from? But that now I look back and I think about my PowerPoints, and if I had extracts and if I had images that had just had that byline, or, you know, this is who created it, this is where it's from, that little habit might have seeped into them a bit more. So I think that's one tip I'd try and say to you, even if it's, you know, it might not necessarily be a PowerPoint or just something for display. If you're handing out something in packs, if you can try and just add in where it's from, I think it's a good thing to help you think about, do I have permission to do this? Is it okay to use? But then also it's modeling really good accreditation to the students, which is what they're going to have to do, whether they go into essay-based subjects or design or you know, anything else, arts and so on. So I think crediting sources, crediting what you're handing out to them is my one big tip. I hope that would help.
So it's interesting that you mentioned design there, because as I said at the start, I'm a teacher of design technology. So we actively encourage people to utilize the inspiration of others. There are very few eureka moments like, say, the Tim Berners-Lee internet invention, for example. You know, James Dyson got his idea for his DC-01 from an extractor unit he was working in. So what point does using other people's inspiration become a copyright issue?
Well, that is, but to be honest, the $1 million question, because I think that's, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a copyright lawyer, but I think that's where we start hearing about copyright. Copyright's rarely in the news for a good reason, I find. It's often because it's a case that's being hard. Wasn't there a monkey that took a photograph and there was a copyright case about this? This is in our scheme of work. You know, people do take cases to court, and it is so down to the individual circumstances of that case as to where that answer lies, unfortunately. When did inspiration stop and copying begin? So if you do, we've got a little mini scheme of work on our site. It's got a London bus case you might have heard about, where two photographers took a black and white picture of London and put the bus in red. And that's a really famous court case because it was considered they were so similar. But unfortunately, it's not an answer I can give in terms of inspiration and copying and imitation being the greatest form of flattery and all that. It is down to the circumstances of each case. But I think as educators, obviously, we can know that if you're copying straight from a book to hand out to students, that's quite clear cut. But in terms when it starts getting to design and so on and so forth, it's a bit more of a nuanced issue. And I just think a healthy dollop of kind of common sense, I suppose, if the students kind of look at what they're doing and their individual case, it should help. The Intellectual Property Office has got a lot of good resources on this that particularly could help with design students, I think, and registering, you know, things like patents and trademarks and so on and so forth. So if you do want to look at that in more detail, the Intellectual Property Office is a good place to start.
That'd be great, thanks.
Do you think that teachers know enough about copyright laws?
That's a really good question, because you said, do they know enough? So I don't think, I can only really reflect on my own practice. And I was teaching for I was a head of department for 7 years, taught for about 9. And I never was told in my PGCE or CPD or anything about copying. And you know that you can't copy this textbook from cover to cover, right? And now that I've come out of that world, I can see how damaging that is in a way, because we do rely on the resources of education publishers and authors a huge amount. You know, when I think of the specs that were introduced in, you know, as specs changed, I was really reliant on the textbooks that were coming out from publishers. And if we do kind of if we don't respect their intellectual property rights and we don't expect copyright, then we're not going to be getting those resources for much longer, because it's just not sustainable. So I do think it's important teachers know about it, and I don't think they do. I don't think it's an arduous thing. There's not a lot to know beyond some key aspects, some of which I've introduced you today. So I think it's often down to the fact that I mentioned earlier that copyrights is quite an intimidating thing. I can see when people ask me what I do now, I can see their eyes narrowing, and they're kind of like, it's a bust. You've come to check what we're copying. And teachers are a bit wary of copyright. I can see why, but I think if they just kind of are willing to get their head around a couple of key elements of it, then that will be that really will help and be a huge boost. But I think that's a fair point, Rosie, that maybe copyright is at the long end of a long list of things to know about, and maybe people could do with a little bit of a booster class in it. And yeah, CLA is working on doing some of those things.
I think it came into kind of, well, there was more attention given to it through lockdown when actually kids were at home. So how do we get those materials to them immediately? And I think that's when teachers started thinking more about it.
Yes, I totally agree. There was we noticed a real upsurge in contacts and queries, people looking at our site, because of how do we get print materials digital? How do we get it to the students? So I absolutely agree. It's really put it on a lot more people's radar. And I don't know if you would both have a view, but I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it. How is teaching going to return? Is there a new normal? Is it going to return to as it was? Is it far more blended? Obviously, I'm conscious you still may have a lot of students out that you still need to provide resources for. So it has, if there is a new normal, I think it has helped to put copyright a bit more at the heart of the conversation, because there are so many more different ways to copy now and share, and it is becoming far more ubiquitous and everyday. So yeah, I think that's a really fair point.
How do we go about promoting this more then, would you say?
Well, I think as everybody kind of knows, I think with teachers it's word of mouth is the thing that's really going to help. It's one thing for me to kind of phone up a school or a multi-academy trust or a local authority and say, can I do a presentation? But until people start talking about it in the corridor and kind of saying, oh, did you see that poster by the photocopier, for instance? Or have you used CLA's education platform? Or, I think you've copied a bit, when you see somebody going for half the book, you can I don't know if that's okay. I think it's just chatting about it and talking about it and word of mouth that can really help. And I'm hoping that some of the resources that I've pointed out to you there are helpful. They're not just dogmatic and telling you about copyright, but they're giving you the tools to talk about it with colleagues, talk about it with students. And if you like them, then do feel free to share that. And if you don't like them, do feel free to tell us, because unless it works for you, there's no point us foisting these things on you. They've got to be accessible and they've got to help you understand copyright. So I think that's the key way to change it. And I think also getting to talk to trainee teachers. As I touched upon there, I was never told about this when I was doing, say, my PGCE. I don't think, Rosie, you're saying no as well, that if you're told that early on, it is a habit for life. And it doesn't, I often say to people, copyright when you get to the court cases, it can be complicated, but at its heart, it's not. It's, did you ask if you could use my stuff? I mean, I was fighting about that when I was 7, my felt tip pens or whatever in school. Basically, that's at the heart of copyright. So I think if we can get at people early, and especially train teachers who are training, 30-minute session, and we can give them the basics, and that will really help. So we're working on those things. But yeah, talking about it and copyright not being a dirty word in school, I think would help as well.
It is interesting how many times I've heard, but we're teachers, it's for the kids, it's fine.
Yeah, and I do, it's important that I correct that assumption, but I was one of those people too, entirely. And I do understand it, because you need something for tomorrow morning. The kid 9-1 are not going to wait until you've got permission from a publisher or whatever. So I do totally understand that, but the fact remains, there's nobody exempt from copyright unless it's one of the copyright exceptions, those circumstances that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's important for teachers to know about it, because it's just a kind of, it's about protecting yourself from infringement, but I think it's also, and more importantly, about modelling it to students, because a lot of them will go on to work in these industries that rely on the copyright and rely on copyright protection. So yeah, it's something, it's so fantastic that I get to talk to you both today, because I think once everybody kind of sits around the table and we can share what copyright is, everybody sees that it's a helpful thing. but it's just being able to get at the teachers to tell them, because I know how much everybody has to do.
Well, that was great. If you could send me the information, I'll make sure I'll send that on to my colleagues as well. Oh,
fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely pass that through via Shine. And yeah, I'm thinking about, there's loads of videos and everything. We've got some teachers who are also authors on our YouTube channel saying how much copyright means to them. And yeah, when you think about, say, textbooks that you use that have got contributors, they're very likely to be teachers themselves. So it's about kind of making sure that everybody's fairly paid for the work they put into it. But yeah, thanks for that offer, Alan. I'll inundate you with materials now. I'm sorry you said it. Super. Well, unless there's any other questions.
I've got no more. Thank you.
No, I'm all good. Thank you.
Super. Thank you both so much. That was great. And yeah, I'll sign off for now. Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Bye now.